The following video will concern the subject of self-defense, firearms, and ammunition, and whether it's practical to do either of them, and reloading, as well as, well, some caveats I'm going to give at the end will explain away a lot why I'm bringing this up. So today I looked up what are the cheapest rounds that exist versus what are the cheapest components for reloading. I looked up separately the projectiles, that's the bullet, the propellant, and what type of powders there were, made a little table, and the primer that's used for each of the cartridge types, and then finally the cheapest or easiest to replace casing. For those of you who don't understand, when you fire a cased ammunition, the firing pin hits the back of the cartridge. Usually in the dead center of that will be a primer. The primer is expended. It's a consumable item. This ignites the propellant, another consumable item. It can't be remade. The primer can be remade, but it's not practical for this video, so we're not going to discuss it. The next thing is that gas expansion, the propellant, pushes a projectile out of the barrel. So when people talk about reloading ammunition, they're talking about having that empty spent casing with a dead primer in it. They knock out the primer with a pin, they put another primer in it, and then press it in place by any number of means, anything from a complicated piece of machinery you might have seen to quite literally just shoving it in there and getting it in tight enough. Then the next thing they do is they put in a measured amount of propellant, and then making sure that they don't let the thing go off while they're doing this, they then seat a bullet into it, the projectile. Now, this implies that you're buying projectiles, propellant, and primer, but you're not buying the casing. Now, please understand that you can remelt projectiles that you fired into a practice target. If you make a target that's supposed to capture them, called a bullet trap, I did a video on that recently, well, okay, months ago. This makes it easier. They'll either fire projectiles that can be just reused by firing them into, let's say, water. Depending on the projectile, that actually works. Or they'll just melt them down and make new ones. And, for those of you who don't know, the act of putting the parts together can require either no tools or very specific tools. In the case of 9mm, the only tool that has to be actually really precision, only required one, is for making sure the bullet is seated correctly to the right depth so that the cartridge will chamber correctly. Preparing the casing, annealing the metal, all sorts of complicated things are being ignored here because in some cases, depending on how you do this, you can make this really simple and not need to do many, many steps. So we're only going to consider the costs here. We're not going to consider the time, the effort, the energy. So let's look up the price for the cartridge here, the 9mm. It's the one that showed up being cheapest across the board or almost entirely. Not 12 gauge, not 22 long rifle, which is much, much harder to reload than you might think, or 25 ACP, which is rare. Really it is. So I looked up bulk prices for 1,000 rounds. That's how they do it. Okay, that's $310 around that point. So 31 bucks for 100 rounds, 31 cents a round. That's our baseline. Now, what if we're just buying enough to get along and we are planning on reloading? A kind of a sweet spot where the numbers stopped being so erratic based on sales was buying 100 rounds at the same time. Suddenly you're not getting bulk rate, but you're getting stable numbers over many months in some cases, at least according to other people. And I also looked up the yearly pistol qualification drill required by police or the FBI, and it hovers around under 100 rounds, so okay. And also looked up the number of times per year the average police officer has to discharge their firearm, spreading it out among them, and then multiplied it by enough to where it was 100. Honestly, they don't fire it very often. Also looked up the number of shots on average used in self-defense situation, home defense situations, and also, well, I looked up how often drive-by shooters fire. I figured I should look that up just in case it'd be interesting. So we're going to number it at 100 rounds that you actually need if you're going to reload them. If you're going to fire more often than that, well, do you really need to? Some of you out there immediately are responding in a tacticulio operator way. You need a minimum of 500 rounds. Well, you can go ahead and do so. The rate from 100 to 500 is almost flat. I'm basing it on 100 for doing math. Here we go. And also, Some of you might not realize you don't need more than 100 rounds if you're going to reload them. And it may be easier to do that. So I looked up 100 rounds, cheapest ammo, 9mm. $20 per box, each box having 50 in them, $40 for 100 rounds. That's our baseline we have to beat. Now I tried to do it as a reloading cost and be unfair to reloaders as much as possible. I looked up the minimum costs for all of the consumables and replacing the cartridge itself. Basically making cartridges from scratch. How expensive is this upfront cost? The upfront cost in materials, not for the tooling and the equipment, the bullet seeder and the whatever, or even the thing for remelting lead if you wanted to. We're actually buying the bullets here. For 100 rounds of pistol powder worth, using the cheapest ammunition grade, a pistol grade propellant, worked out to 100 rounds could be reloaded for $1.20. So 1.2 cents per round. So that's $1.20 for 100 rounds so far. But you have to buy it as a consumable container for $24 for 1 pound. So upfront cost for this is the highest. The propellant's $24 up front, but there's enough propellant in it to reload 2,000 cartridges. But it's also the cheapest thing in the bunch. So what's the actual expensive item that we have to buy again after this first reload? The bullets. $9 for 100 of them, 9 cents a pop. But if you can find a way to reload them, reuse them, or just melt them down and make new ones, reloaders are notorious for this, you don't have to pay that. And that's $9 on top of our $1.20, on top of our $24. And that was, those were lead alloy bullets that were made from range scrap. Well, what's the next expensive thing? Well, $4.75 for 100 primers. Okay. And it was the ones that would fit the 9mm cartridges. What about the 9mm cartridges themselves? Because instead of reloading, we're just going to make them. That was $3.20 for 100 of them, or 3.2 cents each. So literally, the two most expensive things are the propellant, but again, you get 2,000 reloads worth, not just 100, and the bullets. So if you can just remelt your bullets or find other lead and make them, it becomes more practical. But let's see what the worst case here is. And again, I'm including the casing. We're just making ammunition from scratch here. We have to beat $40 for 100 rounds off the shelf. To make them from scratch from reloading components, upfront cost, I said upfront, is $41. But what's the reload cost? $18, maybe $19. And that's buying the bullets in the cases. I'm not talking about reloading here. I'm talking about just making ammunition and just using up the other 1,900 reloads worth of propellant. Buying the bullets, the cases, the primers, and continuing to use your powder is still literally half as expensive as buying the cheapest ammunition I could find. That's the end of the video at that point as far as if you were looking that up. As of today, and again, it's only because 9mm showed up being the cheapest for all the components and for the cartridges. Now let's talk about the reloading process here. Now I've got to do my little caveat here, and I'll probably put it at the top of the video. There aren't any affiliate links. There's going to be a link going to an archive of an imager containing all the links that go to where I'm talking about. These are just being discussed for numbers reasons. But let's review. Even if you buy bulk cheap ammo and it's 30 cents a pop, or if you buy 100 rounds pseudo retail as cheap as possible at 40 cents a pop, reloading the ammunition at 18 cents a pop is still cheaper. So how difficult is it? Well, a little doohickey for popping out the primer is necessary, but you can find one by blunting a specific size nail. Okay. Next stage, put the primer in. You put the primer onto it, press it down, and use literally a nut driver, push down and shove it in. It's an empty metal cartridge that has a dead primer. You pop out the primer, put in a new one. Okay, what about loading propellant? It uses a little measuring scoop, or you can just make one, put in a specific amount, 3.5 grains or whatever. That's the device. So what's the complicated device? something to make it to where the bullet seats in correctly by doing one of many things. Resizing the mouth to make it work correctly, or putting it in and squeezing it shut on it by crimping it. The main thing is to make sure that the mouth of the cartridge will work correctly. It has to be the right diameter and shape so that it'll feed correctly and stop the cartridge from going in too deep and not be squeezed down wrong. And the bullet needs to be seated just right, and it needs to be a gas-tight seal. And it's usually crimped slightly. So a couple of specialized tools. Okay, how much do they cost? $40. You can do it on a table. And according to a bunch of YouTube videos I've been able to look up and other people writing about it, reloading 50 rounds in 3 hours in an evening is pretty common capability. But again, if you don't use 100 rounds in a year, hint, hint, maybe you won't need to reload them very often. The main thing that everybody said is remove the primers as soon as possible, clean it up a bit, and then when you want to reload, just reload whatever you used, and you'll always be ahead of the game. And just cycle it through so you use the oldest stuff first. Well, what about remolding the lead? That worked out to a $40 to $80 2 to 8 cavity aluminum mold. Or some people pour the metal into a metal tube, an aluminum tube, let it cool, and knock it out of the metal tube and get out a big chunk of basically lead wire that's around 5 feet long, and then cut it off at specific lengths like 0.6 inches, and that will make a slug that can come out of the barrel properly. They might put it into a resizer where they pound the bullet to a certain shape so it has a rounded nose so it'll feed correctly in your average semi-auto, but that's about it. So $40 for a mold. The kit for doing the reloading parts where you crimp things or whatever can be as low as $40. The entire upfront kit to make the cartridges is $40. It's $41. It's $120 just to start doing the ammo, and the gun itself is $100 to $150 to $200. And that's me using a high point as an example, which honestly, if you get it used, it may work better than brand new because the brand new ones are not really totally finished. And again, this is based on being able to qualify in the FBI and looking up how often they discharge their weapons in the line of duty versus training. Now, if you're obviously wanting to train a great deal, reloading would be cheaper. If you're not going to be training a lot, reloading is still ridiculously cheap because it goes from $41 down to, oh, by the way, I mentioned we're not actually reloading anything here. We're just buying more parts. If you're actually doing reloading, all you're doing is changing out the primer and continuing to use your propellant, which means it's not 18 cents a round. It's 5. That's why people reload. They go out and find lead wheel weights and melt them down and make bullets. They go find bullets in a berm where people have fired cartridges. Now, what's cheaper than all that? In case most of you haven't noticed, most of you don't own a firearm and haven't had a need to use one. And even if you own one, most of you would actually be an honest person and say, there's very few instances I've actually needed my firearm. The next thing a lot of you might be saying is, well, I need an AR-15 because I want a 800-yard range or something. And then you'll immediately quote self-defense statistics that talk about 21 feet. Neither of these are accurate scenarios. Most of you have spent your life doing what actually works and costs almost nothing. Running the hell away or preventing it in the first place. Worried about home invasion? Make it really difficult to break into your house and teach your family to practice safe practices. Stay in good shape. Cardio, zombie land mode. Literally learn how to avoid being shot. Well, no, there isn't any and then you get people who talk about, well, what about the accuracy of these reloads? You're shooting something you are going to claim at the same time as 21 feet away and 200 yards away. How accurate does a 9mm need to be if you're less than 50 feet away? Okay? And it's all about training. Well, it's still better to reload to train. And again, $40 for 100 rounds. One way or another. But it's only that if you do the dumbest way to reload by just making it from scratch. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that.